This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. Hey guys, there is something really compelling about fatherhood in fiction. Honestly, parenting in general is a massive part of contemporary fiction, and many of your favorite narratives probably focus on the interaction between children and their caretakers and the consequences therein. These stories become highly personal to us in ways that we may not even expect. A huge section of the Baldur's Gate 3 fanbase thought that the horrific maniacal vampire villain Cazador reminded them of their parents. This channel's claim to fame was a dissection of BoJack Horseman, a show steeped in generational trauma passed down to its core characters.
Don't you sing those songs in your nightclub act called My Daddy Was My Mommy while gazing longingly at a tangled string of pearls. Pearls are for ladies, BoJack.
But as of recently, there has been a focus in pop fiction specifically centered on fatherhood. We've gotten story after story after story about dads and their relationship with their children. And interestingly enough, many of the stories have the dads as evil. Their fatherhood is viewed through an investigative lens of destructive parenting and personal loss that cascades down onto their children. These stories, I would argue, have provided us some of the most enthralling parent-child dynamics in years, and has opened the door to inventive, nuanced storytelling styles. And as a script and novel editor, it is my pleasure to go over how these evil dads have come to be, why we love engaging with them so much, and how we might write them ourselves. But in doing so, I think it would be wise for me to acknowledge that this subject can hit close to home for people dealing with their own parents. So I would recommend checking out our sponsor, BetterHelp. Therapy is one of the most important decisions that some people make in their entire lives. Now, I might be a bit biased on that, seeing as I have my master's in psychology and have worked as a clinician, but honest to God, I think I hold that opinion because it's true. Having a therapeutic relationship with someone who knows the ins and outs of psychology is different than just venting to a friend. A good clinician can help you become a better expert on yourself. They can help you challenge yourself and grow in ways you didn't think possible. And to find these clinicians, BetterHelp is a resource I've heard praised over and over again. It connects you with a licensed therapist who's trained to listen and help you reach your goals. With BetterHelp, you can have your therapy sessions as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that, whatever is the most comfortable version of therapy for you. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/savagebooks. BetterHelp can match you to one of over 30,000 therapists in your network, which gives you access to a wider range of expertise than may be available in your area. If the therapist you're matched with doesn't feel like the right fit, which can be common when starting therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about your insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. I know this is a really big step for some of y'all out there, but if it helps, clicking my link not only supports the channel, it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Go check it out. Getting back to our make-believe dads, we are going to discuss them in 3 groups because the variations of fathers in fiction come in 3 distinct waves. The first group that we will look at comes from the late 20th century and is almost entirely comprised of animated fathers. Now, I understand that there are plenty of classic, decades-old, non-animated fictions that have iconic fathers. However, the specific topic of discussion here is not stories where fathers just appear, but stories where fatherhood is a prominent and defining part of the narrative. That just happens to be mainly in animation. So with that in mind, the first group actually stands in contrast to the multitude of evil fathers that we have today and will eventually talk about, I promise. In fact, fatherhood in the late 20th century pop fiction was nearly exclusively represented as opposing evil. This is because these father characters had a narrative purpose of investigating the concept of traditional fatherhood itself. And most of the prominent narrative ideas surrounding fatherhood encompassed leadership, authority, protection, and most importantly, sacrifice. These were the fundamental traits that many high-profile fictional fathers exhibited. These father characters acted as the embodiment of the moral and thematic message in their narratives, meant to be idealistic examples for both their children in universe and the audience watching. And because there was this expectation for consumers of these fictions to learn from the father, just like the characters within, the narratives often presented fatherhood from the perspective of the children. The son or daughter receiving the lessons of the father was the protagonist, and the struggle of the conflict often boiled down to whether or not they could meet the moral standard their father set for them or earn their father's approval. Think of Zeus King Triton, Mufasa, King Nadak, and Kerjak. All these authoritative, powerful, determined fathers were viewed through the story being centered around their children. And because the core traits of leadership, authority, sacrifice, and protection were aligned with fatherhood, those who stood against these ideals, the villains, were most often not fathers. In fact, many famous narratives of the late 20th century saw these villains in active conflict, either against the father character or the father's child. This paradigm of fathers being heroic protectors and villains being childless psychos was meant to establish a theme that true fatherhood is antithetical to evil. The villains were almost always childless and completely unsympathetic to the merits of children or family, which meant that they were unfit to represent fatherhood at all. As you can tell, this style of representing fathers was a very philosophical one and sought to make a clear moral argument for what a father really was. The messaging was often very black and white. True fathers are gods and kings and heroes. They are good. Villains are those who do not value the innocent or families. They are bad. This first group, the heroic fathers, those that represented unwavering protection against evil, were meant to be seen as aspirational and therefore already embodying all the necessary traits that we should want to achieve. These father characters didn't really need to evolve because they were already written to be examples of what we should aspire for. Now, this is not to say that some of these father characters didn't have their own form of growth. They did. Characters like Kerjak and King Triton became more accepting and open-minded, but this was viewed through the lens of their child and the lifestyle their child wished to lead. But as for the ways that these heroic fathers went about leading, protecting, and sacrificing, those remained consistent and unchanging. Now, to get into literary terms, this, by definition, categorizes this first group of father characters as static and simple. But even though these terms sound harsh, they're not. They're merely objective ways to look at character. And a simple character is one whose characterization does not have competing or contradictory qualities. All in all, this era of characters explored fatherhood in a philosophical, idealistic, and fundamental way, always through the perspective of the child receiving the fatherly lessons. These narratives centered the audience and its characters on what it meant to be fathered properly. However, because fiction is free-flowing and amazing, there are exceptions to these late 20th century era exclusively heroic fathers. Some fathers in this time span were evil, and these exceptions are very famous. The cult classic that will probably be the subject of my next throwback breakdown, Treasure Planet, features the pirate captain Long John Silver. He is undoubtedly a father figure towards Jim, but also undoubtedly represented as a villain, at least initially. And of course, we have the most famous Western villain of all time, Darth Vader, Luke's father. Both Long John Silver and Darth Vader are interesting outliers for this time because they are not meant to be seen as exemplary or idealistic representation of fathers. In fact, their narrative representation is much more complex and nuanced than the heroic fathers we discussed previously. Darth Vader and John Silver are depictions of morally fallen fathers who are redeemed through a relationship with their child. Vader and Silver's story is still told from the perspective of their child, like the heroic fathers, and the men have journeys based in leadership, authority, protection, and sacrifice, like the heroic fathers, but the difference still stands in the complexity. Instead of one aspect of their worldview changing, Vader and Silver's entire characters changed, and the transformation was compelling to watch because dynamic characters are by far the most engaging. And that complexity actually transitions us to our next group of dads. Where the previously discussed heroic fathers were a baseline, fundamental exploration of true fatherhood as a concept, these upcoming characters created a genre of storytelling that used fatherhood to go one step deeper and explore the concept of masculinity. This was achieved by having traditionally masculine characters put into a fatherhood guardian role over a dependent, usually adoptive child. And don't get me wrong, this style of narrative has always been popular, like for centuries, but it went through a bit of an explosion. There are a few reasons why this brand of storytelling has achieved such prominence. First and foremost, recent years have caused us to dissect what masculinity even is. Remember, most of us had bought into the static and simplistic representation put forward by the early heroic fathers. This second group of father characters are far more dynamic and complex, meaning the ideals of fatherhood that they represent, and therefore masculinity, are too. And the masculine nature of these characters come into play through their typical representation. See, these adoptive father characters almost always start their stories off as hyper-masculine individuals. Not always, but very often. These characters are frequently authoritative, aggressive, and play to the traditional masculine sense of coolness through their danger and expertise. They are generally emotionally reserved or detached from social connectivity.
Well, why the fuck? What's all this bullshit been for the last 2,000 fucking miles? What? Shut the fuck up!
They are averse to showing weakness or creating bonds. And of course, they are usually very violent. These characters are the embodiments of exaggerated masculine traits, hypermasculine. But likewise, these father characters are usually broken, pained, and their hypermasculine traits are usually revealed to be unhealthy coping mechanisms linked to a previous tragedy. This allows for an interesting investigation for what masculinity actually means. See, the number one trait these fathers either fear or are mocked for is becoming soft. Through the relationship with the child character and the deepening of their bond, they are naturally compelled to shed their unhealthy coping mechanisms and become emotionally invested in the child.
Getting in too deep here, Morphy. Next thing you know, they'll be saying I've gone soft.
This investment then can be seen as a vulnerability or a weakness by the father character or the friends he keeps. This is because the father's hypermasculine traits have become part of his identity through necessity. The father's anger and aggression and mistrustfulness have served to keep him alive in past dangerous situations. However, for the father to best protect the child character, which they are usually compelled to do for plot-related reasons, the father becomes less aggressive, less violent, and less confrontational in order to put the child in harm's way less. This results in a lessening of those hypermasculine traits we discussed earlier, which in turn causes an overt or covert identity crisis for the father. The storytelling space is set up to investigate the social concept of whether being more emotional and less aggressive makes you less of a man. And this investigation is done through fatherhood, which is often seen as the peak of masculinity, a natural position of authority that allows you to lead, protect, and sacrifice. But unlike the heroic fathers of the first group, whose narratives were told through the perspective of the children as the main characters, these broken, hypermasculine fathers are the lens of their own story. They are the main characters. They are the perspective we are given, because no longer are we concerned about what it means to be truly fathered from the position of a child. Now we are exploring fatherhood from the view of fathers themselves, and how traditional masculine traits can be misused to actually inhibit fatherhood.
So I'm a man now, like you?
No. We are not men. We are more than that. The responsibility is far greater. And you must be better than me. Understand?
Because of this, many narratives centered on a hypermasculine adoptive father argue that you must first be a good man before being a good father. These characters often must address their own personal shortcomings before being able to properly protect the children they have adopted. Left undone, the father risks passing on the same unhealthy qualities to the child, which is ultimately a perversion of fatherhood itself.
We can do whatever we want.
That's what I said to your mother, right before I gave it to her.
Through this representation, these characters are dynamic, complex, and therefore gray. When I say gray, I mean a character who is not all good and not all bad. These fathers have the capacity for harm and toxicity, but also the capacity for care and nurturing. And usually by the end of their narrative, they have become more complete individuals because of the transformation they underwent due to nurturing their adoptive child. But as I said, this second group of fathers is dedicated to looking at masculinity through the lens of fatherhood. The last section of father characters goes even deeper and becomes more complex. And these are who you came here for, the evil dads. Funny enough, completely evil, unrepentantly malicious dads are more rare in Western pop fiction than you might think. Some of the more famous ones are Ozai, Augie Smith, Trigon, Frollo, and of course, Father from K&D, my personal favorite. These fathers are just as static and simple though as the heroic fathers of the first group, though they stand as moral opposites. The evil fathers are obsessed with leadership and authority, but show no interest in sacrifice or protection. They have no real hint of good or moral conflict in them. They are simply exaggerated allegories of misused paternal power, most often viewed from the lens of the children they affect, not even acting as true investigations on fatherhood. This is why most evil characters with large roles and narratives have not been fathers or had children. Their villainy precludes them from actually acting as fathers or making any commentary on it. But that is where our final group of fathers comes in to fill the niche. See, where the first group we discussed, heroic fathers, investigated fatherhood as a baseline concept, and the second group, the hypermasculine fathers, investigated masculinity through the lens of fatherhood. This last group, the evil fathers who care, goes deepest to the most fundamental aspect of characterization. It investigates humanity through the lens of fatherhood.
He's a child in a man's body. That does make him easy to lie to. Are you still my friend?
See, what's even more central to a character's personhood than a masculine identity is their identity, period. And through fatherhood, the complexity and intricacies of these evil characters' identities are able to be explored in truly nuanced ways. Where the heroic fathers largely explored fatherhood from the position of the children, and the hypermasculine adoptive fathers explored masculinity through the perspective of the fathers themselves, this third group of evil fathers who care explores humanity and the emotions therein from the perspective of both the fathers and the children. The hardship that the child goes through is equally as important as the personal journey and struggle that the father is on.
My father,
Dracula?
is a man of science, a philosopher, a scholar, and knows things our society have forgotten 3 times over. Do you still not understand the enormity of what we're doing? He's gone mad, and from that, there is no recovering him.
The child must reckon with the lessons they were taught by the evil parent, and the evil parent must constantly challenge themselves by standing against their child. And in most cases, the evil father actually has genuine care for the child they oppose, and that is where the nuanced complexity comes in. For so long in fiction, narratives featuring prominent fathers represented their characters' morality as black and white. The childless villain men were always completely evil with no ambiguity. Or if the villains were fathers, they were so unquestionably evil that they barely exhibited fatherhood at all. This simple representation of villainy made these characters effective as avatars of bad morality, but it made them as conceptual and idealistic as heroic fathers. These black and white villains were more of a warning of what evil could philosophically look like, rather than a commentary on any person you'd actually meet. Because actual people aren't black and white. For all the bad and evil that people do commit, everyone, at some time, has loved someone or something. That's just a part of humanity. And that is what the evil fathers who care represent. They are examples of the conflict that can exist inside not just men and fathers, but anyone. And the differing ways their narratives play out show us the multifaceted nature of the human heart. Take Thanos versus Silco, for example. Both of them had adoptive daughters that clearly they cared for and to a degree shaped in their image. But to achieve their goals, both of these evil fathers were faced with a choice: sacrifice your daughter and succeed, or save your daughter and fail. And even though both these men occupy the same paradigm of evil fathers who care, their narratives play out completely differently. Silco loved his daughter more than his personal ambitions, so he chose to fail. That's insane for a villain. Thanos chose his personal goal over his daughter, but he did so thinking of it as self-sacrifice, doing a service for existence that cost him all that he cared for. Dracula from Castlevania, their animated series recently, wanted to wipe out humanity for what they did to his wife, but he had to kill his son to do it. In that moment, Dracula rediscovered his humanity and gave up on his goal. The evil fathers who care are so compelling because they stand at the height of complexity for how villains can be written. They stand above the black and white tropes for what villains can or cannot be.
I'm not a bad guy.
Ryan, get back upstairs. Right now.
And the tropes they do engage with are often subverted. The evil fathers who care are as gray as they come. They exhibit the qualities of the heroic fathers through leadership, authority, protection, and sacrifice, but in a corrupted way that provides a view of fatherhood from the uncanny valley. Their relationship with their children and the care they have threaten to make them soft, but in this case, softness doesn't mean less masculine, it means less evil, more human, and the mystery of whether or not they will continue with their plans, even at the risk of losing their child, is an eternally compelling one. Modern representations of evil fathers interrogate the human heart in conflict with itself. These narratives dive into parental connection, arguably the deepest connection there is, to put forth questions of what good and evil really is. People are complex, and all parents are people. It is characters that can reflect this reality that speak to us most deeply. We don't like our dads written evil because we like evil. We like them because they're written like us. Anyway, thanks for watching all the way until the end. If you like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you really want to be a homie, support on Patreon, check out my TikTok, check out my website for editing services if you want me to look at your manuscripts, or if you just want to talk to me, schedule a coaching call. I also have books if you want to read those too. I kind of do everything when it comes to writing. Also, check out our sponsor for the day, BetterHelp. They really can connect you with a therapist, and I think it's really, really good for people to get into therapy, especially now with how crappy things constantly are. Anyway, thanks for watching all the way until the end. As always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.